Good, you're good.
This is Frank Wilson, and I'm sitting here with Wendy Cope, and we're going to have a conversation about largely poetry. I just put to Wendy downstairs a question. I had mentioned in pretentious way that Gertz's autobiography is called Poetry and Truth, and I wondered if Wendy thought if there was a kind of truth that could best or only be expressed in poetry. She had an interesting response to it, and I think you'd like to hear it.
Well, to begin with, I said, I don't know the answer to that, and then when I thought about it, I think not. It seems to me that, no, I don't think there's any particular kind of truth that can't be expressed in prose. So I think my answer to that is no.
Are there subjects that can't be expressed in poetry, do you think?
And I think the answer to that is a definite no. I think Sylvia Plath once said that she couldn't imagine a poem with a toothbrush in it, and I think one or two poets have then rose to the challenge of writing a poem with a toothbrush in it, and I think if anyone says, you couldn't possibly write a poem about X, then some poet would go and do it.
But you also said that poets write poems about subjects that interest them. But they couldn't necessarily, or wouldn't necessarily, write poems about everything that interested them.
Well, no, I mentioned the example of the stock market, because I follow the stock market quite closely, and I haven't written a poem about it, but it's an interesting idea. I might have a go.
Have we got the possible genesis of a poem here?
Oh, you might have, yeah.
Well, there's an interesting thing right there. We're sitting downstairs talking about what you can write a poem about, what you can't write about, and saying that if you're interested in it, you ought to be able to write a poem about it.
I don't know about ought.
Okay.
But if you're interested in it, you certainly have to be interested in it if you're
Right.
going to write a poem about it. And, you could never be sure that, I could try and write a poem about the stock market and it might be no good. You can never be sure it's going to work.
Right. But might that sort of experience where we're just having a conversation and the subject of the stock market and poetry comes up, might that be how poetry, in your case, tends to come about? What generates a poem in your case?
Well, people sometimes say, where do you get your ideas from?
Right.
And I say, well, if I knew, I'd have them delivered every day
Oh, okay.
on the doorstep. So it's hard to say, really. Sometimes it's something somebody says or something that happens, or often I actually wrote a poem this morning, and I think the reason I've written a poem here is that I'm staying in an apartment by myself, and I've had quite a lot of time I actually wrote a poem this morning, and I think the reason I've written a poem here is that I'm staying in an apartment by myself, and I've had quite a lot of time just to sit around sort of talking to myself, and that's often a good thing. Just talking to myself about all sorts of things, and quite often an idea for a poem will come out of that.
Do you get ideas from your reading?
Yes, sometimes I do get ideas from things I've read, and quite a few of my poems have epigraphs, which are a sentence from something I've read, which kind of explains. Well, often that sentence, that may have been the genesis of a poem, or it may be something that has fed into the poem. So I put it under the title.
You said downstairs that you deal with subjects in poetry because you are a poet. That is.
Yeah.
This is a general, possibly leading question. In what way is poetry satisfying for you? Both in the sense of the creation of the work, the literary artifact, and whatever personal resolution it might provide you, if any.
Well, in various ways. Some of my poems are written because I'm feeling very emotional about something, perhaps upset, but not necessarily. And I just feel the need to try and write about it. And it can be very helpful. There's something about sort of organising trying to get to the exact truth of what the problem is and to write it down, and often, to give it some kind of shape. It seems to help. An example I give is there's a poem I wrote about my grandmother not long after she died. And I said it didn't stop me grieving for my grandmother, but it helped. Writing the poem did help.
Both in the sense that you were obviously engaging the experience, the grief.
Yeah.
But does the actual formalization of it, does that contribute to the...
It does help, and people sometimes sneer at the idea of poetry as therapy for the poet, but my theory is that if it works as therapy, it works as poetry, and vice versa. That something happens in the course of writing it down that helps. But I mean, sometimes, with quite a lot of my poems, I start off being very upset about something, and then I see my way through to a funny side, of it. And I'm not, I didn't end up laughing about my grandmother being dead. There's some, but some things where it's, about my love life and so on, that I will end up with writing a poem that was much funnier than, I expected to, because somehow I've worked my way through to something else.
Through the romance.
Yeah.
Do you write on I remember there was recently a biography of George Barker. Apparently George Barker got up every day and sat down and wrote poetry, pretty much as if it were a job that he went to as an office. What is your preferred method of operation?
Yeah, I don't do that. Because, well, for one thing, my life isn't like that. There are so many days when I'm not at home, I'm somewhere else, or I've got to do something else, and quite a lot of my time is taken up with admin of one kind or another. But I do think that in the last few years I used to just wait for a good idea to hit me, and sometimes I didn't write poems for months or even years. But I have realised now that if I try, I have actually just been trying a bit harder, and what I had to work out, and really, it makes me feel very dumb that it took so long to work this out, that what was getting in the way of writing was I was afraid to try, because there is nothing more depressing than the empty page and you can't write anything, or you start trying to write something and it's no good, and it's just so depressing that it's kind of easier not to try. And when I realised I just had to be a bit braver, and I had to sit down with that blank sheet of paper and I had to try. And it's amazing how many more poems I've written.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's interesting, because I have, my wife paints, but I'm just a retired hack writer, so, but the one thing about being a hack writer is you get up.
You have to get on with
You
it.
sit down and write it, because nobody's going to, they want it by 4 in the afternoon.
I know, horrendous. I didn't like it at all.
And I pointed out to my wife that you really can't spend your time getting your studio neat and clean. You artists don't do that. I mean,
maybe some artists need it.
I know that my office at home gets increasingly messy as I'm working on one.
Yeah, that's also true for me. But there are some people, not all of them artists, who just need everything around them to be clean and tidy.
Everything.
And if you're that, I guess there's some poets and artists who are that kind of people, and then they would need to have everything in order.
I suspect that Auden wasn't one of them.
No, I'm sure Auden wasn't one of them. No.
Neatness was not his long suit.
In fact, I can't put off the top of my head think of an example of any poet I know who is obsessively neat and tidy, but there may be some.
How young were you when you first started writing poetry?
Well, I wrote my first poem when I was 6 because I was told to write a poem at school. That's the only time in my school career I was told to write a poem. And that was a one-off, and then I didn't write any more poems. Until I was 14, I wrote some really bad adolescent poems in my spare time. And then I forgot all about it again.